Hi, and good morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I flew in from London yesterday, and it's my second time in Trondheim. I was here 4 years ago as part of a task force of Chinese experts and international experts looking at what we called at the time the low-carbon industrialization strategy for China we were looking at. And one of the hot topics actually in those roundtables that we were holding was this idea of the circular economy, which at the time was just starting to be a kind of hot topic in policy circles and just starting to make inroads in business. But I think we can say that over the last 4 years, it's really started to become much more of a mainstream proposition. And it's great to come full circle, if you like, and to come back to Trondheim, talk about the same issues. And as you will see in my presentation, I actually touch a little bit on links between Europe and China later on. So I was asked to talk about the circular economy from a fairly global perspective before hopefully some of the other speakers can drill in a bit more detail. So I decided to take a little step back and ask why people are talking about the circular economy and why there's such appeal to this concept. And I think that the fundamental thing is that in the past few years, the rest of the world has realized what people working in the environmental business have known for a long time, which is that we're using a tremendous amount more resources than we can probably cope with sustainably. And if we continue to scale that up over time, it's quite hard to imagine how we're going to be able to cope with that. So many in the room probably know the energy story fairly well. The latest IEA figures suggest that we're going to be using about 1/3 more energy in 2040 than we did in 2013. We're already producing quite a lot, of course. But if you look across food, metals, water, a whole bunch of commodities, you get a similar picture. We're going to need an awful lot more. And one quite staggering statistic came out last year for the International Resource Panel, which was a big report that was produced for the G7 last year, which found that today we use about 85 billion tons of natural resources. In 2050, because of larger population and also increasing wealth, we can expect to use about 186 billion tons under a kind of central scenario. An absolutely huge ramping up. And I think just at that top level asks real questions about whether we're going to be able to cope with that. But what really put the topic of natural resources on the map for senior decision makers in governments and in businesses, and in the conversations we have at Chatham House on a daily basis with both of those, was not so much what environmentalists or scientists were saying, but what was happening in the markets. As many of you remember, really, over the last 10 years, we saw a huge ramping up in the prices of all different kinds of natural resources. This chart just shows the prices for energy, for metals, and for agricultural commodities, and how they all sort of shifted up from about 2004 onwards, with the quite famous price spikes around 2008 and 2009, particularly for food commodities and energy commodities, which had reverberations politically as well as for consumers. And so it was the sort of following on from that in the following period, around 2010, 2012, that people really started to think, okay, maybe we need to do something differently. And that was the period where the international community was shaping up what were eventually called the Sustainable Development Goals and agreed in 2015. This is a set of goals which sets out the international community's commitment to sustainable development out to 2030 for both developing and developed countries alike. And there are 17 goals, which obviously I don't have time to go into in great depth today. But I just wanted to mention one thing, which is that the United Nations Environment Programme argues that 12 of these 17 are only deliverable if we manage natural resources properly for various reasons. And that's on a direct basis. If you think about the indirect effects of mismanaging natural resources, arguably the whole thing depends on it. And then later in 2015, we obviously had the momentous agreement in Paris, the climate change agreement, which doesn't itself focus on natural resources because it's outside of the remit of the UN Convention on Climate Change. There is just one mention of resources within it. But of course, it completely depends on managing natural resources properly. And again, the assessment for the G7 following Paris argued that about 60% of the emission savings, if you look at where we would expect to be in 2050 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we can cut 60% of those by managing resources better, both by reducing the amount we'll need to dig out the ground and what we do dig out, managing that more properly. I guess the classic response to this, and an important one, and it's been mentioned here already this morning, is of course resource efficiency, energy and resource efficiency solutions, which have, they are multiple and huge. This is just, the chart is just showing one assessment from McKinsey, again from about 2011, I think it was published, which finds multi-billion-dollar savings available if we manage energy, land, water, and in this case, steel more efficiently. Absolutely extraordinary opportunities. Although one has to ask why these things don't happen automatically, and we don't have time to go into that today, but there are lots of reasons why, for either political or for example, the impact of transaction costs, these things just don't happen on their own. And of course, energy efficiency has moved a long way, particularly in Western countries and particularly in Northern Europe and I suppose also in Japan and South Korea. But while we've seen tremendous resource efficiency improvements across the board, including in some emerging economies actually over the last decade, the need for raw materials still continues to increase. And the example I've given here, sorry, this one is a little bit geeky, but it just shows the case of aluminium. And the red line shows the share of aluminium that is the share of aluminium production, which comes from scrap aluminium, which ideally, I suppose, in a circular economy would be 100%. And you can see that with the growing use of recycling and, I guess, environmental regulations in the 80s and 90s, it does climb from a very low level to about 20%. But it's been stuck there ever since, and this is, in part because of a huge ramping up in demand from China. But essentially, even though we've been ramping up recycling, we've also been ramping up primary production. We're using more and more of the raw material. So these sorts of questions about whether we can really deliver a classical energy efficiency in the way we were hoping to, and also whether we can keep up with the pace of change needed, started to lead people to ask, well, maybe if resource prices are high and volatile, we can start thinking about this in a different way. And I think probably the most eloquent description of this has come from people at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which does an awful lot of work on the circular economy. And they describe this as making a shift from a take, make, and dispose economy to a circular one. And what they mean by take, make, and dispose is that the economy as it stands is largely based on digging things out of the ground, processing them, manufacture them into products, and at the end of their life, they get thrown away. And maybe just before the end of their life, we recycle them and reuse some of those components, but we don't do very much in the middle to try and recover the maximum value possible. And it's in that space that the circular economy, I suppose, is coming to life, or that's the hope. And all of the assessments here find even more staggering savings and economic opportunities, I should say, even staggering in comparison with those classic resource efficiency ones. So just one of the McKinsey estimates for this argues that there may be 1.8 trillion euros available for Europe by 2030. I mean, huge, even if we can capture just a slice for that. And one assessment for the UK focused more on jobs, found that actually we might be able to create 3 million extra jobs in resource-related ways, in circular economy-related ways by 2030, tackling unemployment in parts of the country which have suffered from unemployment for many decades by perhaps about 500,000. And we've also seen, over the last few years, increasing numbers of very large companies, as well as small ones, but I've shown some of the larger firms here. Some of the largest firms in the world are signing up to the ideas around the circular economy. I think many of them would admit they haven't completely shifted all of their business models over to focusing on the circular economy, or they haven't yet, but they're exploring what that might mean. At this point, I think it's important to recognize that what I've just described, I suppose, is new thinking that's come out of the resource boom is really thinking which was developed and elaborated in the 1960s and 70s and beyond that, particularly in Europe, particularly in Germany and here in Scandinavia, but also in East Asia. And the example I've shown, I'm certainly not going to go to in great detail, but it's just the famous example of Kalundborg in Denmark, which a industrial park which was established, I think, in the 1950s, but really started to take on an ecological industrial approach in the early 1970s, including with Statoil oil refinery. But this is an industrial park which has all kinds of industrial sectors, a plasterboard plant, fisheries, a cement factory, as well as an oil refinery and a power plant, all sharing waste products and heat between each other. And I guess has become a symbol for what might be possible. And later in this session, you'll hear from a Norwegian industrial park, which is making some of these things come to life. So I guess the question is, if this was available as an idea, as an opportunity in the 1970s, why have we not managed to do more of this already? And there are many reasons for that, which I can't go into, but I would say that the two I haven't mentioned on the slide, which are important, are the impacts of government regulation and policy, which I think is something which has helped to catalyze this, and the impact of resource prices. But the one I've focused on is information technology, and I would argue that really we wouldn't be seeing much interest in in the circular economy had we not had a revolution in data and information systems. The chart just shows the incredible proliferation in devices connected to the internet and how they're continuing to grow. And the scary thing is that we're near the start of this chart. The number of devices is really growing incredibly fast. And of course, it's not just your laptops or your mobile phones, but it's increasingly the Internet of Things. The kinds of things which this enables are things which probably had been predicted that might be possible under the circular economy, but that were not really practical before that. And they are things like being able to track all of the assets in the economy so that we know where they are. We probably know when they need to be repaired at the right time. We can build platforms for the sharing economy. We'll hear a bit about that later today. The sharing economy, not strictly circular in a sense, but what it allows you to do is optimize the amounts of things that you need, maybe reduce them. So although there is a great debate about the environmental impact of Uber, the hope is that by shifting to a model like Uber rather than owning your own car, we might need less cars overall, that kind of thinking. Exchanges for secondary materials trading are being built at the moment. There's a really interesting example in the United States. And the idea here is that at the moment, when one industry has a waste product, they have only a limited understanding of who might want that product, and often they're in the immediate vicinity. And how do you build up a network so that everyone can understand that? Well, systems are being built that really help to facilitate that kind of exchange. At the moment, that requires a human expert on the phone as an intermediary, but the hope is that through machine learning, we'll be able to pair up those kinds of materials so that this becomes a scalable proposition. So what kinds of economic opportunities are we talking about if we're talking about making gold from green today? Well, I would say that there are 4 areas, and I've boiled down the language here, so if there are any circular economy purists in the room, I have to apologize. The first is making things last longer, which could be about making them more durable, which is where material science is hugely important. So a company called Questech, for example, is producing high-strength and tough steel alloys, which are able to be used in aircraft parts and can be used for a lot longer than traditional steel alloys. But also modularity, puzzle phone. I don't know if you've heard of that, but they're building a modular phone which can be repaired and upgraded. I've mentioned the rental and sharing models already, so I won't mention that again, but I think it's plays an important role. The third area is what I'm calling a second life here. And this is about whether what might be considered a waste or a used item or material from one industry might be a really valuable commodity in another. And two examples from the energy sector I've pulled out here. The first is that GM, BMW, and a whole raft of other automobile manufacturers that are involved in manufacturing electric vehicles are starting to wonder what use we could make of the batteries in an electric vehicle when they come to the end of their life. Because even though they need to be in top grade condition when they use an electric vehicle, maybe we can use those batteries again in a second application. And the hope is that they could be used in stationary on-grid storage as a really readily available, cheap source of battery technology. We don't know yet, but that's an interesting one. And the second one is an organization called Zero Waste Scotland in the UK is doing a lot of work in the North Sea, working out what assets in decommissioned oil rigs could be used again in other industries. At the moment, they are taken down and recycled where possible, but they're not really reused for other industrial applications. And potentially, we could unlock huge value there. I think that over the last few years, what we're seeing is a sort of emerging race for leadership in the circular economy. And if you go to different parts of the world, you'll hear different governments talking about the circular economy in slightly different ways, with slightly different language, but all with a similar theme. And it's around what the industrial opportunities are, how to reduce the need to import natural resources, particularly in sensitive supply chains, but really how we can be leaders in what is this emerging area. But I don't think that conversation is very joined up at the moment. The two examples that I'm just going to touch on in my speech are, I guess, the European example and the Chinese. Because the EU package, which was agreed at the end of 2015, but is still really being rolled out in earnest, has huge implications for the future of the circular economy and how we understand it. In a sense, Europe is trying to rewrite the write the rules for what will become the global circular economy. And there are 5 areas. Really, you could do a whole presentation on the implications of the EU package, but I will just explain the 5 areas and what they include. So they're focused on production, by which they mean manufacturing of goods. And this is about changing the eco-design directives and a whole raft of other regulations and directives which apply to manufactured products to encourage circularity within them. The feeling is that the traditional ways of measuring the performance and environmental performance of goods is not quite in line with what is needed to enhance the circular economy. There's supposed to be a lot of action at the consumer end, but I'll touch on this in a moment. I don't think there's really enough there. There's a lot of work around trying to create the markets for secondary materials. I talked about an exchange earlier, but what other ways can we incentivize that? By changing the prices for secondary materials in comparison to using primary products. And there's a very large amount of investment which the Commission says it's going to be able to put into circular economy practices. So many of you will probably have heard of the Juncker Plan, which is the Commission's vision for how it's going to pour finance into a future energy system and infrastructure system and, in general, upgrade the competitiveness of Europe. Well, a very large chunk of that, the Commission says about 315 billion euros are going to be raised and focused on circular economy measures. How's that going to be spent? We don't know yet, but that's a really important area for people to focus on and play in. And really the focus so far, because this is a package which is being rolled out over time, has been on waste management. And I think this risks sending a little bit of the wrong message, to be honest. Some of it is welcome, but it does mean that at the moment the Commission is largely focusing about increasing recycling rates and reducing waste. These things are important, but they're arguably missing some of the more exciting narrative at the front about how we can build new businesses, create new value in the circular economy. Nevertheless, Europe is one to watch. And the second is China, which kind of in the background, and certainly with very little international engagement, has been developing a circular economy strategy that is now more than 10 years old. The first Chinese circular economy law was launched in 2005. And the 13th five-year plan, which started just a year ago, really places a huge amount more emphasis on the circular economy. One target within the 13th five-year plan, for example, is that waste productivity should increase by 15%. The amount of resources needed to produce 1 unit of economic value should decline by 15% over those 5 years. And I've shown a slide of the industrial parks because China is asking what are an absolute multitude of industrial parks across China focused on all different kinds of applications. For the first time, all of them, or actually strictly 80% of the national parks and 50% of the provincial parks, are expected to have very detailed circular economy strategies rolled out in the next, what is now the next 4 years. That will lead to a huge amount of activity. I want to leave you with 5 thoughts, which hopefully you can bear in mind as you listen to the other speakers and go away and think, when you see the circular economy discussed in other fora, and perhaps be a little bit provocative. The first is that I think there are 4 priorities for the circular economy, which people often present from their perspective, but often you don't see them on the same slide together, and sometimes they're in tension. So I won't go into them in detail, but just have a think about this. So I spoke mostly about the opportunity to, I suppose, build what I'm calling resilience to resource pressures, use less natural resources. That's the environmental and social imperative. There's also, of course, from a business perspective, this is about, is there a value proposition? Where can we create new products and companies? Where can we make the savings? But the 2 others, which I think probably deserve more credit than they're currently given, is the opportunity for tackling climate change, so fitting in with the previous 2 speakers, because the opportunities for what I'm calling here deep decarbonisation are very closely overlain with some of the thinking in the circular economy. So just one example, I suppose, given the time, I will just mention that there's a lot of interest around carbon capture and use. We heard the minister talk about carbon capture and storage this morning, but carbon capture and use, using the waste CO2 in productive applications, in all kinds of products, whether they're from fertilizers to insulation materials to concrete, is an absolutely enormous opportunity and maybe something that Enova could look into more. But finally, the social economic benefits, which I think are often downplayed in the circular economy. I'm doing a lot of work now in the developing world on this subject, and of course, whether this is going to have an impact on jobs, on the informal job sector, and in general on livelihoods, whether there's access to water and land, whether the circular economy can help on that. These are the things which often really matter. The second controversial point would be to say that at the moment we have a lot of national strategies, and there's very good reason for that. You can easily imagine why the circular economy might be good at protecting your country from a spike in energy prices, or building local industry and creating local jobs, and all of those things are fantastic. But a lot of the opportunities can probably only be captured if we link up internationally, and that might be around the design standards for circular economy products. It might be about aligning regulations so that we can trade in secondary materials, or it might simply be about sharing knowledge. This is a slide from a snapshot of a new system that we're building that allows you to look at all natural resource trade, and you can see that already it's a very global picture. I'm going to come back just now on one of the earlier speakers who talked about the importance of putting people at the center. I think one of the problems at the moment is that the circular economy strategy, as it's framed by technical people, arguably by people like me, but certainly by the European Commission and others, puts technology first, puts the environmental objectives first, and the role of people within this is sometimes secondary. And this is a problem both in terms of opportunity, because we need to work out what people really want here. I don't think they want things called the circular economy, by the way. I think they want the added lifestyle benefits and excitement that comes with consuming things in different ways, as well as the safe knowledge that what they're doing is sustainable. But also, I mentioned already some of the downsides that can affect people that we can't just skirt under the table. I've mentioned already that I think we need to put climate at the center. I think we need to be looking at the overlap between the circular economy and climate change agenda. And if you have a pot of money, that's where it's that overlap, really, that we should be focused on. I've mentioned carbon capture and use as one possible focus, but there's also people working out whether by looking at supply chains in a slightly different way, we can capture different kinds of emission savings. It requires thinking not just in a sectoral way, but between sectors. And finally, I don't think we can have a conversation about these sorts of matters right now in the political climate, having been up all night watching the sort of horror stories unfold in the United States. We obviously have to recognize that when you're talking about a disruptive shift in economy, in society, and the circular economy is arguing that it's going to be a disruptive shift, well, we're going to have to think about how we present that to politicians, how companies interact with this issue to make sure that they have a social license to operate because they're they're presenting this in the right way, they're providing benefits to communities of different kinds, and so on. So we're going to have to do a lot of thinking about the politics, and I don't think we have yet, largely because this is still an agenda which is in its very early stages. But we better get that right, or there will be a lot of resistance to it. And I would say, actually, beneath the radar in the UK, that's a narrative that has prevented the circular economy being more prominent than it otherwise would be in our new industrial strategy. A concern about what it might do to existing industrial areas and the potential resistance to it. And we also have to be honest. I think I've probably presented the circular economy as a sort of catch-all solution. There are many, many opportunities, and I think you'll hear more of those exciting opportunities. But we have to recognize this isn't going to work in every case. There may be some cases in which a circular approach actually takes more energy, or is less sustainable, or is politically not viable, or there are better ideas. So I don't think we need to be wedded sort of in a religious way to thinking about the circular economy as right, but we have to make sure that whatever we do is sustainable. And then finally, I guess finishing where I started, we do have to think about where the circular economy fits in with our climate change objectives under Paris and the Sustainable Development Goals. At the moment, there's a bit of a danger that we're developing parallel tracks there. And I would say, once again, we've got to put climate first. Other sustainable development questions also absolutely critical. And hopefully, we can work together to build a circular economy which is compatible with both of those objectives. Thank you very much.